Hello, everyone. My name is Jamile Davoudi, and I'd like to invite, I'm going to welcome all of you to a Zanan monthly meeting. And this is a very special meeting here because we have Dr. Sona Kazemi, who I had the pleasure of actually interviewing when I had the Zanan Nime Barobar podcast in year 2020. It's almost like 6 years ago. And I remember at the time when we talked to Dr. Sona Kazemi about, the work that she does, which is a very, very unique work. I mean, she actually has her PhD from Toronto University, and then she moved to US. And her specialty is actually on the area of disability. And I remember that even then, when I was doing the interview, the way that Sona looks at disability is very different than what we all used to view it. And I remember that one of the point which was very interesting for me was the way actually the patriarchy and the government and is actually treating the like killing someone versus disabling them. It is part of like a mechanism of also really suppressing. And I remember at the time we were talking about her thesis, and actually the new book that she has published is actually part of the thesis that she has, the Disabling Relations, the book that she just published in 2025 is actually based on her thesis, and obviously it took her a few years to publish it. And I really just want to congratulate you, first of all, Sona Jan, and thank you for accepting our invitation and being here. And I thought that we just start with you talking about your book. What inspired you to write it, and the challenges, what you want people to get out of it. So after your talk, then we can open it to questions and comments. So with that, again, thank you so much for being here, Sonajan, and we are all waiting here to hear your talk. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jamila John. This is such an honor to be here with all of you in this beautiful monthly meeting group that you have, Zanan NorCal. I actually initiated the invitation, kind of imposed myself on your monthly meetings, asking Jamila Jan to host the book talk for me, and she graciously accepted. So thank you so much for that, Jamila Jan, and for organizing this, and for all of you to be here. It's actually for me, it is a moment of homecoming in a way, because there are Iranians present, in the audience, and that is really rewarding to me, because usually in the academic setting, I just get to, present this work to academics, or, some meetings that are open to public, students, but they're not necessarily, I mean, there are not a lot of Iranians around, but this book is about Iran. So, and I'm also a bit intimidated by the fact that, there are lots of Iranians. So I hope that they like it and they engage with it. I also want to acknowledge that Shahla Talebi is here, one of my dear mentors, who actually helped me a lot with one of the chapters of the book. And then my second book, which is a derivative of the first book, a lot of it is there, the data, because of Shahla Jan. And I will mention how Shahla Jan has helped me if I get a chance to talk about methodology. Also, my dear Shekufe Sahi is here, who is not just a mentor, but a close ally, friend, colleague, sister, and I have just learned so much from Shekufe that I'm not able to fit it into these already existing adjectives. So Shekufe just means a lot to me. Just her existence in this world means a lot to me. All right. I am going to, without further ado, I am going to share a slide with you If that's okay with you all, I am going to. Oh, it looks like I need to ask you, Jamilajan. You need
Yeah,
to
I
allow me
just gave you
to.
room. Yes, please. I
Okay,
just
thank
yeah.
you. I just want to share to make things easier for our audience. After all, it is a disability studies lecture. Um, can you all see
Yes.
my slide?
Yes,
All right,
actually.
fantastic, fantastic. And please feel free to turn on the captions so that you can follow along with my writing. And I'm happy to provide a copy of the presentation after so that for access purposes, if you want to follow along, because we don't all process information at the same speed. So in the spirit of disability studies, let's just accommodate everybody and be conscious of that. All right, so my presentation, which is the title of my book, is Disabling Relations, Wounded Body Minds, and Transnational Praxis. If you work at a higher education institution, university, please ask your library to order it. And if you want to buy it, it is about $30 with a promotion code 25FNBK that I have written here. So please go ahead and order it. All right. So I want to acknowledge the indigenous land that we're on. If you're joining from US and Canada, that is probably the case, I guess. Just want to acknowledge the indigenous land that we're on, and thank the indigenous people and the settlers for welcoming me in. I feel like this continent has adopted me. Please feel free to move around, stretch, do whatever your body needs to do in order to remain engaged in the conversation. I want to give you a trigger warning, although research shows that it doesn't really work that much, but I still want to give you time to prepare yourselves for the presentation emotionally. I will be discussing torture, acid attacks, disfigurement, burn, and different forms of state violence. I encourage you to prepare yourselves emotionally beforehand. If you believe that you will find the discussion to be traumatizing, you may choose to not participate in the discussion or leave the meeting, and I will not be offended. And again, this doesn't mean to scare you, it's just to prepare you emotionally for the conversation. All right. Um, the book basically starts with a famous quote from Marx that probably everybody has heard, but I want you to revisit this quote in this conversation from my viewpoint. A child who is born in the middle of Iran-Iraq War and has inherited the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and the war with Iraq while political dissidents are being tortured and killed in prison. And as the regime is getting rid of its external and internal enemies at the same time. And I want you to look at it from that point of view, from a child's point of view who has no view of the pre-revolution or any other society and just is just born into what we know as, the Islamic Republic in the making, especially at the years that it's consolidating its power and establishing itself. The feminist in me, of course, has changed men to women and people. People make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And again, I have changed that to the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare and a dream on the brains of the living. I usually have a map of Iran because, again, I usually present to non-Iranians. You all probably know this, but I kind of historicize and locate myself in my research in order to give my audience a way to engage with the the location of Iran on the map and the geopolitics of being Iranian and what it means to be from that part of the world, basically. And then I will explain why that is really important to my central question and this book. That may not be apparent at first sight, but I'll promise you I'll get you there. Buckle up for the ride. The seeds of the questions I address in this book were planted during my life as a young girl living under Islamic Sharia law in post-revolution Iran, and later during my work as a disability rights activist in Canada and the United States. Growing up in the 1980s and 90s in a society that had gone through a revolution and a war in less than a decade meant encountering body minds everywhere. And I'm going to come back to what I mean by body minds and why I use the word body mind instead of bodies or people. I was born in the middle of Iran-Iraq war during the bombardment of the cities. Mushak baran shahrha, they call it in Farsi. My mom went into labor hearing a bomb that fell in Esfahan, and her water broke, and she had to go have an emergency delivery in the hospital that night, and nobody was prepared for it because I was born prematurely. I was 4 weeks early because of that, and that really affected my life in so many ways. I can come back to explain it. And that kind of made me really interested in war injuries and injuries that are caused by war. And later I expanded that to injuries caused by deliberate violence, right? Because usually when we think about disability or any kind of injury, we think about something that you're born with, right? Like autism, or let's say a cognitive disability, developmental disability, or you may acquire disability as a result of an accident. Like you have a spinal cord injury, right? You have an accident, you have a spinal cord. But what about injuries or disabilities that are generated, inflicted on your body as a result of violence? And in the Iranian culture and language, in Persian language, we don't really look at that from the viewpoint of disability. We call it maluliyat. Again, it's something that you're born with, but not the injuries. Injuries are usually called asib, right? We try to distinguish between the two, and there are reasons for that, and I'm going to come back to explain all of that. So just bear with me. So growing up in the 1980s and 1990s in Iran, in a society that had gone through a revolution and a war in less than a decade, meant encountering wounded body minds everywhere. And I've deliberately been using the word wounded, and I'm going to come back to the materiality of the flesh and why I call this wound. In battlefields, institutions, nursing homes, prisons, psychiatric hospital. So by wounded, I mean individuals who have become disabled as a result of violence inflicted on them through the horrors of war. Chemical weapons of mass destruction, shrapnel shells, minefields, displacement, and through the political violence unleashed by the Islamic Revolution of 1979, crushing dissent, purges, torture, forced conversion, execution, and unmarked mass grave. I grew up haunted by these two wounded groups comprising the generation before me. Those who were killed in the war or came back disabled, as well as those imprisoned, tortured, or killed by the newly established regime. In other words, these two generations, or wounded groups, as Marx put it, weighed like a nightmare and a dream on my brain. So the first group comprised wounded individuals, disabled veterans, and civilians who had acquired a physical or psychological injury either during the war between Iran and Iraq or later in nursing homes, hospitals, and asylums where they were shelved away. And I'm going to come back to talk about this group that's why I'm holding on to the slide here, and I'm happy to describe it for those who may have a visual impairment in the audience. So on the right-hand side, the above right, there is a hand of a Kurdish child in the city of Sardasht who has been exposed to chemical weapons, specifically mustard gas. And on the left-hand side, it is an image of a amputee, I guess you call that, of a Iran-Iraq war veteran that is being fed by his probably wife, who is also taking care of children, as probably has cooked the food as well, which shows the post-war society that we were living at a time. And I'm going to explain how the regime would take us on these mandatory tours to nursing homes to show us the disabled bodies of the veterans in order to not to make us care about them, but to probably indoctrinate the next generation of their ideology of martyrdom and jihad and what it means to get disabled for the state and die for the state. And I'm happy to come back to all of that as we go forward. So you can see the psychological and physical health problems and the lack of access to clean water and electricity in the southwestern province, probably of Khuzestan during the war and after, that the regime basically did very little to repair, which is really ironic that Khuzestan is like the very oil-rich region of Iran. It basically funds the regime, kind of, right? And yet it's very neglected. And then we have economic issues, low value of the Iranian currency, underdevelopment, and horrifically inadequate care and support for civilians and veterans, and which is the basis, the foundation of my research during my PhD was understanding how the regime takes care of the veterans and disabled civilians, or lack thereof, right? Or it actually doesn't. And the domestic abuse cases, changing family dynamics, unemployment, and etc. And on the right-hand side below, you see the image of a woman sitting in front of, this is a sit-in that this woman was doing in front of a veterans foundation, Bunyad Shahid, and Vajambazan Vaisargaran, which the regime calls it, the foundation for disabled veterans and martyrs. So this woman, whose husband had come back from the war with severe disabilities and has gotten worse over the years, really needed help with financial and social support, and she was neglected. Their 14-year-old son had committed suicide. And this woman was desperate to receive some help because her husband was also bedridden and had severe disability. And I'm aware that bedridden is not a very good word, but I don't want to use worse words. So this woman had a sit-in in front of the foundation, and the Foundation of Martyrs and Disabled Veterans did nothing to help this woman. And she self-immolated, put herself on fire in front of the foundation. And this is something a lot of disabled veterans have been doing since the war ended. And when I was writing my dissertation in 2016, this is what she did. And the timing was just really crazy that I knew about her grievances, and then she suddenly did this. All right. Okay. Just bear with me. I'm just going to read a little bit from the book and what I was seeing growing up. The second group that really haunted me, besides the war veterans who had come back disabled from the war and who were getting worse with regime's inadequate support in nursing homes, and also the culture and the Iranian society's lack of really awareness around how to deal with disability, what is disability, and the prevalence of ableism in the culture. Unfortunately, they were really neglected. But I'm going to come back to that. So the second group consisted of dissidents who had become disabled or mad, fighting the regime in prison cells, solitary confinement, and torture chambers. So suddenly, at the same time, what I kind of knew was going on, but not exactly, and then got to know more when I left Iran, was what was going on in prisons. and how the dissidents were being treated and how they were acquiring injuries, physical and psychological, while being in prison. So there was another group of people who were being wounded by the regime. So as a child, I didn't have the vocabulary or analysis to describe, let alone explain what was happening to the generation before me. It wasn't until I became a graduate student in disability studies that I realized that the disability I had witnessed in those wounded body minds was not just a biomedical or health issue, as we usually approach disability, right? But a socio-political wound, right? An injury that was caused by the violence of war and political suppression and sustained by denial, inadequate care, structural neglect, and state terror. This reminds me of a quote by John Phillips where he states, "The wound as an event which brings the knife and the flesh together can be reduced to neither knife or flesh." After joining the Disability Studies program at York University in Canada for my master's, my bachelor's was in psychology, but I wasn't really focused in disability studies at that time. My rotten wound, my own rotten wound, now found a place to open its mouth. I started questioning everything I had witnessed growing up in Iran. I found myself wondering why, as a 7-year-old child, I had to cover my hair and body to go to school. Why there were no boys in my school at the shift that we attended. Why girls and women sat in the back of the bus. Why only women had to follow the Islamic dress code and wear a veil or a hijab or a headscarf, and not men. Why my Baha'i friends couldn't go to university. Why fathers could behead their daughters with impunity. And why some men threw acid on the faces of women who had rejected them, walked with impunity, or served minimal sentences while going home for the weekend. Why couldn't women become judges? And why was their testimony worth only half that of men in court? Why were labor unions crushed, criminalized, and their members arrested? Why was the civil society, even charities, helping child laborers under attack and their main members imprisoned? Why did many poor and neglected war veterans who couldn't provide for their families set themselves on fire? Why were poor people who had resorted to theft to survive subject to amputation in town square with an electric saw? While bigger thieves ruling the country embezzled millions with impunity. Why were the rich disabling the poor? Why was a person executed every few hours? After leaving the country in search of a better life, these and many more unanswered questions led me to seek an education in disability studies. However, the existing theories and models in the field seemed disinterested in the wounded body minds that I had witnessed. So let me give you a very short introduction to disability studies for those of you who may not be familiar with the field. Let me just explain this. I'll promise to be very brief in a couple of minutes. So usually the dominant way we think about disability almost all over the world and in almost every culture is that disability is a problem to be solved, right? Is a biomedical or a health issue, right? Is a defect, is a deficiency in the body, usually but like biological, and it resides in the body of the individual, and it's definitely a problem. And in order to solve it, we should either seek cure, go to the doctors, do some military medical intervention, or go to rehabilitation, or go to physio, just solve it and get it over with, right? But disability studies has a very different viewpoint to disabilities. In the disability studies dominant models, which is usually called the social model, disability is understood as a social problem. So basically, in disability studies, we believe that disability, yes, there is an impairment in the body of the individual who has a disability, but that's not all. Disability is a social creation, is an imposition that is added on top of the person's impairment, right? That the society adds. So basically, in order to approach disability from the social point of view, we think that if you remove external barriers, for example, if you put a ramp in front of a building and have an elevator instead of stairs, there is no disability. If that person with an impairment can still participate in society fully, can go to school, can go to work, then is there a disability actually, or is that a social creation? And it treats disability as something that belongs to everybody. And you can remove barriers and enhance the person's quality of life while making it everybody's responsibility. So it's not something that gets solved by cure, but rather it is accommodated in an accessible world where accommodation becomes everybody's responsibility, right? So it requires social change, not just cure, right? It requires barrier removal, not just rehab. It requires anti-discrimination law, anti-discrimination education, not just normalization, right? So imagine, for me as a young grad student, this was such an emancipatory idea. I felt liberated, especially as a woman, as an ethnic minority from Iran. I felt like, what if we could look at everything in this way? Right? What if a lot of ways that we understand the world is because of, normalization, right? Even if you think about sex and gender, right? A lot of times, sex and gender mirror the same, dichotomy between impairment and disability in some ways. Anyways, I don't want to get sidetracked because I am a disability studies scholar. I can easily, go crazy by this, gets too excited. But so what happened to me? I came to this program. I saw this emancipatory idea about the social model of disability, but then I was a bit disappointed. Let's see why I was disappointed. By the time I started my graduate program, many critical anti-racist movements had challenged the whiteness of the existing disability studies discourse. But the field had not yet moved past the deadlock of Western contexts, and it mostly remained concerned with congenital disabilities or those acquired by accident in the United States, UK, Canada, and Australia. I felt devastated, and my wound reopened its mouth. The Bodyminds wounded by the violence of war, incarceration, torture, punitive limb amputation, gender-based violence like acid attack, and systemic neglect came back to haunt me. So when I encountered my field of disability studies, yes, they had the social model. Social model was super cool, but it only cared about disabilities in the first world, or the Western world as we understand it, right? US, UK, Canada, and Australia. It didn't really concern itself with the third world, or the countries that are poor, or not necessarily poor, but the ones that may be rich but don't, fall under that part of the map, right? So I was thinking to myself, if 80% of the world's disabled population don't even live in the first world, what kind of literature are we producing? Only concerning the 20% who live in the West? What about the body minds that I witnessed? And also, the way disability studies usually engages, or at least this was the case many years ago when I joined the field, now it's gotten a lot better. They concerned only with disabilities that you're born with or that you receive as a result of an accident, where there is no deliberate like decision making, like war or acid attacks. These are deliberate inflictions of injury. Like for instance, in the war, we have a whole weapon industry concerned with maiming. They don't want to kill you. They do want to maim you. We have blinding lasers. We have cluster bombs. We have a lot of weapons that are designed to maim, not just necessarily to kill. And other people had talked about it. For example, Jasbir Puar has talked about this in the context of Palestine, but there was nothing outside of that in the field by the time I joined the program. So, but then at the same time, when you think about disabilities that are created, if you think about most of the products that we use in the global north, in the Western world, you know, in terms of fast fashion and all the clothes, they're mostly manufactured in the third world, or maybe China, South Asia, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and a lot of countries where working conditions are very bad. Very unsafe machinery are present. Working hours are extremely long. There are many little benefits. So, and a lot of these people become disabled as they making the products that we use, right? So disability, what if we looked at disability as integral to global class relations as well? And especially a racial and also feminist issue, because a lot of these workers are women and a lot of them are racialized, but they also become disabled. So while race and gender had received attention, disability had not received the attention, this type of attention. So what did I do? I was mad that my field was not interested in what I had seen and the way I was approaching disability. I am trying to find, okay. So faced with, in my doctoral program, I got a chance to revisit the tough questions I had when encountering the wounded generations of war veterans and political prisons that haunted both my lived experience and consciousness. So now, faced with disability studies' lack of interest or theory to analyze the experiences of acquiring a disability through war, torture, incarceration, this time as a scholar in the United States, I wrote this book, telling 4 distinct stories of the wounds caused by war, incarceration, punitive limb amputation, and acid attacks in Iran, an enormously complex society, as we all know, with a long history of struggle for democracy and the rule of law and liberation from tyranny. All right, so I think I need to, we have a few minutes. Okay, I want to try to wrap this up. I'm just going to give you an overview of the chapters. I know it's a lot of information. Thank you for hanging in there with me. So basically in this book, what I do is I engage with the stories of disabled survivors of violence in the global South and specifically Iran. And I understand their experience and examine their experience of disability in a violent encounter with and mediated by, you know, other exploitative social relations, right? Such as patriarchy, such as sexism and ableism. You know, ableism, for those of you who don't know, it is basically a type of bias and prejudice that people have towards people with disabilities, seeing them as less worthy, or seeing non-disabled bodies as more valuable than a person with a disability, which is a type of discrimination and prejudice and bias, just like sexism that thinks men are better than women, right? It's the same way. So basically it engages with ableism, but in a very direct conversation with state violence and other types of structural forms of state terror. So the image that you see on the cover is my dear friend Masouma Atai, who was attacked by her ex-father-in-law, who threw acid on her face, asking her to close her eyes while he was putting a gift in her extended hands. And instead of that, while she followed the instructions, closed her eye, he threw acid on her, blinding her in both eyes and disfiguring her face. She lost her career. She was a hairdresser and a mom. She lost her career, and they threatened that they would get the custody of her son and drown him also in a bathtub with acid if he didn't drop the charges. And she followed that to retain the custody of her first son. Masume has gone through 70 reconstructive surgeries on her face. We have a transnational care group that have been fundraising for her surgeries. 75,000 pounds will be raised. And unfortunately, the UK government rejected her visa twice. And we're still waiting to see what we can do about that, especially because money has already been transferred to Sussex Eye Hospital in Brighton. Anyways, I asked her to be the cover. She graciously accepted. And as you see behind her, there's a Persian carpet. And I thought that it's just the dignified position of Masume, this beautiful pose, just breaks everything we think we know about beauty and womanhood, especially in a world that is obsessed with imposing beauty standards on women. So the first chapter of the book is called Ripping the Wound, Transnational Disability Theory and Praxis, which is my contribution to my field of disability studies. When I saw that there was no model to tackle what I had seen, I wrote a new model for disability studies, and I called it Transnational Disability Model. It's based on historical and dialectical materialism, informed by disability studies lens and international relations, considering the geopolitics of Iran and the regime and everything. The chapter I already went through this slide. Sorry about that. The second chapter talks about the disablement that was created in the Iran-Iraq War and the use of weapons and how these weapons were acquired, mostly by a lot of other countries who helped both sides. And I have a detailed account of how those happens, which basically sheds light on the transnational entanglement of weapons industry and state violence and how it is delivered. Then I talk about my own experience of having to go to these visits, nursing home visits that the state made us to do. And I talk about the fetishization of disablement in war veterans and how their bodies are called living martyr, shahid zende, and how the state, the regime uses that to conceal the violence of the war and how it prolonged the war for no reason after the Khorram Shah's liberation in the first 2-3 years, and then after that prolonged war and produce all these bodies, which is a very long discussion of fetishization of disability, which I'm happy to come back if doing Q&A if anybody's interested. But I've written about it extensively. And of course, my favorite, Shahla Talebi and Shekufe Sakhi and many other disabled survivors, not that they are disabled survivors, the survivors of Iranian state prison have helped me to understand what it is to start showing abnormal behavior after being tortured for so long, or how the human behavior can be unintelligible in certain contexts. And of course, this builds on Shahla Talebi's work, magnificent work in Ghosts of Revolution, where Shahla describes these compelling cases of disability. She never calls it disability. Shahla is so poetic, uses a whole Shahla dictionary, I call it, a whole different ways to describe these conditions. But the central thing that I really learned was how Shahla was engaging with the notion of disability without even calling it. And I was really inspired by that. And I tried to and because of Shahla and Shekufe, I talked to basically over 13 years. I interviewed many survivors of prison who talk to me about how their loved ones, their comrades or inmates had started showing abnormal behavior after being tortured. And I try to understand, what is madness? How is disability caused by state violence as opposed to something that is already there and we just need to fix it? But what about contextualizing violence? What about understanding violence? What about re-examining the human behavior in its own context and why it's being produced? And this was the hardest, of course. And my second book is already a derivative of this chapter, which is going to be on prison and psychiatric abolitions and why we need to get rid of prison because it only produces injuries and we need alternatives. Chapter 4, I talk about bleeding wounds. It is called Bleeding Wounds. It is about a punitive limb amputation that is still common in some parts of the world, including Iran. For this one, I couldn't interview anybody, but I was able to access a footage of a punitive amputee who talked about his experience of being amputated in prison for just one petty theft, dalle dozdi, right? Like a small robbery. His fingers were amputated, and how stigmatized he felt. He couldn't tie his shoes. He had to ask his daughters to feed him. And even though Shahram Jazairi and a lot of, these big guys, thieves, never had their limbs amputated. So even the double standards on that is fascinating. And I talk about, a lot of philosophical questions around why disability is seen as a punishment in Sharia law. I'm not a theologian, but I really engage with the theology of how Islam treats the notion of disability, the wholeness of the body, and yet disables you. Has like direct commands on disability without having commands on how to get rid of poverty, because usually people steal because they're poor, but there are commands for that. So the chapter 5, which is second last chapter, I talk about acid attacks, and I interviewed over 10 years. I interviewed 5, 6 acid attack survivors. I created a group with burn survivors, and I circumventing its sanctions. We were able to create this channel of to send them medicine. I hope the government is listening. And we did a lot of work together. And in this chapter, I talk about ableist logic, why acid, why throwing acid. And as an extension of this, in my work after that, I have talked about psychiatrization of dissent, of how Kianush Sanjari and many Iranian dissidents were taken to psychiatric hospitals and were treated as mad, and how that was supposed to be stigmatizing, relying on the already existing ableism in the society, right? And I talk about how a lot of protesters were blinded or shot in their genitalia, and why the state does that in most recent protests, why the regime blinds you. I have already talked about that in some other works, but in this one, I also talk about the logic of blinding and ableism. Why blinding? Why that happens? Rather than just saying, "Oh my God, this is terrible," but why? Right? More philosophical, theoretical questions. And the last chapter is called Active Witnessing. Healing wounds. I was really on the fence about using the word healing. I wasn't sure if there was any healing, but just to talk about the ethics of this research, I really thought that I really needed to be this active witness that is not a prison survivor, is not an amputee, is not an acid attack survivor, right? But in terms of witnessing, I know Shahla has talked about proxy witnessing and Agamben, but for me, it was not really proxy. It was a different kind of engagement with these stories that I had already internalized, and I learned that from Shekufe too, of how you can internalize the archive and become the archive. So in this chapter, I talk about how these people who were going through all these things were not really objects of power. laughter. Where there was suffering, there was also laughter. Where there was power, there was resistance, right? Where there was violence, there were the human spirit. So I really don't want to leave you with these like terrible image of, oh my God, like these things happen. But I want you to learn what I have learned from Shekufe is that people respond to power. People do have political consciousness. People do have subjectivity. And I have learned so much with all these groups, and they have become me, and I have become them. I can't even separate myself from all of these stories. And a lot of war veterans got involved with, peace building and going to Hiroshima to attend these uh, conventions for the banning of chemical weapons, and the regime sometimes didn't fund their trips because of course the regime is founded upon the idea of jihad and martyrdom and war. So these peace building efforts were not really received well by the state, and yet they did it. In the middle you see the image of Masume modeling the acid attack survivor whose story I told you. Masume models, which has flipped the argument on its head, right? Women can be beautiful with a disfigured and blind face, and she is just an incredible person. And I'm not using that as an inspirational porn for non-disabled people to feel good by looking at disabled people and feeling good about themselves. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that she is alive and continues to live, and does a lot of work to bring awareness to acid attacks. And at the bottom, of course, you see my Shekufe. My beautiful Shekufe is here. Shekufe spent almost 9 months in those coffins in Qazal Hisar under Haj Dawood's command. And I mean, torture chambers, and Shekufe prevailed. Shekufe has written her dissertation, which has taught me so much. And I always use that image of Shekufe to talk about, because she is the embodiment and personification of resistance. Thank you so much. I'm gonna stop here and perhaps allow you guys to ask questions. And thank you for indulging me for this long.
Thank you so much, Sona Jan. That was, of course, a very difficult topic, but a very important one to talk about. And, as I always have mentioned it to you, I really am so proud of you for really focusing on such a, a difficult topic. And, you just pretty much covered everything. And also, I'm glad that you did talk about this last of the kind of the act that the government has done in Iran, which is right after, during the Woman Life Freedom. And I thought about it a lot, this shooting directly to the eyes of the young protesters. And I was thinking, this is the way not only they really these are young people, which they have their own life in front of them, and yet they have one eye, or, mostly like one eye is just gone. And also, they will be spotted right there on the street. It's just, I'm sure you will be talking about it. I would want you to talk about it a little, but I know you have written about it. And also I'm glad that you finished by bringing people like Shukuf Sahi, which honestly, I personally, I'm still, I just cannot explain how someone could be so strong to be in those coffins for 9 months and not lose it. Because, so again, I thank you for that. I want to open it to any questions or comments that anyone might have. Or if you want to just talk a little bit more before that, Sonajan, about this act of, again, government purposely, and also I read that they were also purposely were shooting at the lower part of the body of, protesters as well, just like, besides the pain of it, also, again, really disabling them. And then we'll get to Behzad and Shukvejan after that. So if you want to say something about that, Sunat, and then
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jamila Jan. You asked a wonderful question. There was something really nice in your question. You said these young people have their whole life ahead of them, and when you shoot in like one eye or both eyes, and then you can spot them. So that's the stigma, right, attached to disability that is so important that a lot of times people forget, especially like in the story of the punitive amputee that was saying how he's shy, he hides his hand in his pocket. I don't know if I got to say that part, but the stigma is a really big part of disability production mechanism, and how states or other actors, I'm happy to come back to this, rely on that ableist logic to do the job for them. So what I'm trying to say here is when disability is used as a wounding mechanism, whether if it's a state that shoots you in the eye, or if it's a man who throws acid on you, or if it's a father who beheads his daughter, right? Or, well, that is the ultimate killing. But anyways, in all of these things, there are already existing assumptions and logics that the perpetrator relies on. Let me give you an example. For instance, we know that a society like Iran and almost every culture has the ableist tendencies to think that, not having a disability is better than having a disability. And not having a lot of infrastructure in the society to support people who are blind. The shooter knows that, right? So the shooter, the moment he shoots, that is only part of the harming. He is shooting that because he knows that being blind is a stigma. He knows that being blind means that you don't have access to a lot of disability support services in a country like Iran. He knows that, when shooting women in their genitalia can, maybe cause some, harmful physical injuries so they can't have children. Or the acid attack, who throws acid knows that it's very stigmatizing for a woman to not be beautiful because of all the double standards that exist on women's bodies in terms of they need to be pretty, right? That the pressure is there. So what I'm trying to say is the already existing logics in society are also important to examine. And we need to examine ourselves. It's not just one perpetrator who does it, but also, Romina Ashrafi's father, when he went home, his neighbors had lined up to say, you did the right thing. Right? So it's not just Romina Ashrafi who beheads his daughter. All those people do at the same time. So that's what I was trying to say. But thank you so much. I hope that was clear.
No, it was. Thank you. Besa Jan, please.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Of course.
I have two questions, and it could be very, very, very primitive question, but I think this is something that I have been grappling with, and I know that a lot of people are grappling with. One is, what is the correct word for disability? First, it was handicap, and of course, it's not PC, if that word is correct. If the PC word is correct, then it became disability, and then physically challenged. I see problem with both of those. Disability, able, what is able, and that makes the other one disabled. And also, physically challenging is challenging about what? So I'm still trying to find the right word for disability or physically challenging. That's my first question. And the second one, probably three, is that you talked about kind of affirmative action in order to accommodate. You didn't call it affirmative action. I don't know if it was on purpose or because there is such a stigma about affirmative action that some people say it's a reverse discrimination. If you elaborate on that one. And also the third question I have is very common social issue is that that when people with disability or or physically challenging. If you passing by, if you ignore them, they say, well, you're ignoring us. If you try not to ignore them, help out or whatever, some will become intimidated if you want to help out. Or if you look at them and not ignore them, they could say, well, you're staring at us. So how do you deal with this social issue of, living together, these challenges? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Behzad Jan. Those are wonderful questions, and I think a lot of us probably share those questions, right? So I'm happy to tackle them. So the first one is that there is no consensus about what to call a person with a disability, right? Well, I say there is no consensus because every institution and every initiative have their own reasons for why they use that word, and that is something we need to respect, right? Because there's no consensus. Like, for example, if you look at the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is we call UNCRPD, which is a very important convention that the UN eventually adopted, and people who were on board, they all have a disability, and they decided to use the word persons with a disability. And the reason they do that is because they want to say that a person is a person before everything else, first and foremost, and then they may have a disability, right? But then some scholars and activists said, but disability is part of who I am. This is how my brain works. Like, for example, if I have autism, a lot of people say I am autistic, right? It is part of who I am. So I don't say I am a person with Iranianness. I say I'm Iranian, right? I claim it. So it really depends. And, language always evolves, right? It depends on why they use it and what they mean by it. So I suggest always asking the person what they prefer. And either go with awareness. If you want to say persons with disabilities, people with disabilities, that's fine. You want to say disabled people, that's fine. I myself use disabled people proudly, and I love that. Even in the case of prison survivors who, showed abnormal behavior in prison, I call them mad on purpose because madness has a very particular history attached to it. And I love that, right? Because of the mad movement. The other thing is that I have had the honor of inventing a word tavanzadegi for Persian vocabulary before me. There is a scholar, Khanum Dr. Negin Hosseini, who has invented the word غیر معلول گرایی, but I was not comfortable with that because what is معلول گرایی to be غیر معلول گرایی? It was a bit unclear. So with the help of one of my friends, I developed the word tavan zadegi, just like jinsiyat zadegi, right? And I just wanted to put it out there for the Persian speaking purposes. But again, in Farsi, we have tavan yab, tavan khah. We have all these words that have been invented. And again, all of those, as long as we know the reason behind them and we have an intention to use them, it's fine. The other thing you mentioned about affirmative action. No, I actually completely forgot about mentioning it. I understand the stigma around it, of course. In Ontario, for example, we have a law that says if you hire, if there's a company that has, I can't remember the number, maybe more than 100 employees, they need to have at least a few number of people with disabilities in that cohort, right? Exactly to enforce that. But that's just for public. AODA is the Ontario one. Now I don't live in Ontario, I can't remember. But it's really hard to enforce that in the private sphere, like small businesses, restaurants, right? So that is, again, awareness raising, right? My mom, for instance, all the people who work for her in her bakery in Toronto, they are immigrant women with some sort of a mental health diagnosis. And she does that because she's aware of that, because I have been breathing down her neck for years, right? I'm joking, but it is something that a person develops. And I do agree with that, and it should be a law everywhere. And I don't believe affirmative action is discrimination. And I teach discrimination. It is not discrimination. It is actually a way to confront racism and ableism in society. And the third question you asked is always asking the person what they need and never assuming what they need, and not get offended if they don't need help. I would say, always asking, do you need me to help you cross the street? If yes, sure, let's do it. If no, sure. And not be mad, right? Just respecting the person's autonomy and agency. Sorry for the long ramble.
شوفة جان بفهم.
سلام سلام سانا جان، سلام جمیل جان و همگی. عزیزم so hard. Yeah, go back to English. I want to say that Sona, really your research, because as long as I was involved or knew about body, really shed a different light on disability and the disability studies, both of them. I mean, really, you brought this, made it the thing that is taken it from the personal, an issue of the personal, as you said, that we all think of the disability as a personal thing that has to be either solved or dealt with or live with it or somehow, get along with it or get some kind of physically either being corrected or be proud of it, is all stay in the personal, in the private domain. But the way you see it, and you brought it up you just like this, you made it show that how social it is, how it belongs to the public domain, and therefore it's a political issue. And that is and disability, then I can see so easily disability become a disadvantage when in a social hierarchical social order. The same as being a woman become a disadvantage in a country like Iran or countries that it's overtly against women or against non-binary people. Right now, the politics that is coming up in the world, especially in the US, that we see that being non-binary becomes a disadvantage because it's in that social order. So you show it very nicely, and you just open this curtain, and we see it and we relate to it differently. And right now, as you said about the public and the private sector, whenever I go to a restaurant or a bar or somewhere, then I see that when I go to the bathroom, I pay attention. It's mostly in basements. And I always have this immediate thing, and just because my partner became disabled at the end of his life and had to walk with the walker. And I said, so the private sector, so it's like that if you have lost that ability, then you have lost the ability to go to a cafe, go to a bar, go to a restaurant. Is always this. It's how easily it's being translated to a disadvantage because of the social order, and how it can become an easily a responsibility of everybody if we want to change it. So with all of these things, how are you? I mean, the whole things that right now the world is changing, is we getting more and more against any kind of, I mean, the dominant ideology is turning towards exactly the power of the able-bodied, the power of the male body, the power of all the white body. All of these things are coming up. I'm just curious, how is your book being received by the mainstream? or especially because your transnational model is coming out of your lived experience, which is the Iranian experience, and you bring that out, and it's prominent. I'm just curious, have you experienced being ghettoized within the discipline, within your study discipline? If you want to answer this, I'm answering that because when I try to look at prison as not as the Iranian prison or coming out of the prison, but as a phenomenon, as something that is and it's all global. It's really hard. There are lots of layers of resistance to see that it's not just about the Iranian prison. It's also about prison everywhere, Canadian and everything. But so many resistance are there to break through it, especially because we bring our own experience in. So the world tends to ghettoize you inside that thing. So I could cut this here. I'd like to hear about your experience.
Thank you so much, Shekufajan, for your question. I was recording your question. I'm just going to pause this because I don't need to record my own answer. Sorry for that. I needed to ask. It's like me and Shahla. When Shahla was in my place in Ohio to help me, I was just running around with a recorder behind her. Whatever she was saying, I was recording because it was like borderline harassment. But it's the same with Shekufa. Whenever Shekufa opens her mouth, I record it. Thank you for those things that you mentioned. It's just incredible when you receive feedback. It's like you talk to like Larry King, you're this much, and then after he comments, you become this much. It's like Shekufa talking about my work was this much, and then after Shekufa, I feel like, oh my God, I have done something so incredible. I feel important. Thank you for always doing that with your generosity, Shekufajan. It has been difficult, and I do acknowledge those difficulties that exist with Transnational, especially now. I work with a lot of Iranian graduate students, and they tell me that, sometimes they receive like, who cares about Iran? They literally receive answers like that from some of their advisors, like, who cares about it? Let alone like the most marginalized, disenfranchised people in Iran that we talk about, or the notion of prison in itself. A lot of people approach the question of prison as, oh, all those murderers and rapists and pedophiles, of course they should be there. They never want to go beyond that. That's a very small percentage of people in prison who are pedophiles and rapists and murderers. Most of them are for drug charges and like really shitty small things. Anyways, and it's funny you said that, because we now know that 40% of people who live in prison, who are imprisoned, have a disability. So disability is already an abolitionist problem, and abolition is a disability problem. I have faced, because there is so much, I teach race, gender, and sexuality studies in the middle of nowhere, basically. And where I am, the population is 100,000 people. And a lot of the kids who come to my classes are from farms, from small towns, first person attending college in their entire family. And this is the biggest city they've ever been to. And now they have to listen to an accented, immigrant, racialized woman who teaches them to open their mind. So I can't pretend that it has been easy. But I want to use a quote from Rumi that says, being candle is not an easy task. In order to give light, one must first die. And I truly believe that if you're doing hard and path-breaking work, resistance is a completely normal part of it. And you just have to deal with it, come to spaces like this, be surrounded by people like this, and just continue the fight.
Thank you, Sona Jan. That was very good. Arjan Jan, your question or comment?
با درود سنه عزیز, thank you. This was very powerful presentation. Appreciate it. My question is, do we have anything that we can label it as social disability? Let me explain a little bit. For example, I mean, most recent one, just a few days ago, there was an earthquake in Venezuela. You don't see much reaction from public or people. Then you see genocide in Palestine, the reaction from people, bombing of Iran, kidnapping president in Venezuela. So are these becoming norm? Should we call them a form of disability, social disability? Any comment or such? You know, I'm just curious if there is such a thing. Thank you. Peace.
Thank you, Ajangjan. Well, I see what you're saying, and I hear your concern. I mean, it is more of a social numbness, or social indifference, to be honest with you. That's how I see it, rather than a disability. I think what you're describing is a chronic problem that exists in our world, where we pay very selective attention to very selectively cherry-picked things that we want to. And it's really hard to make a discourse out of something, right? I struggle with that in my own work too. I mean, you know, it took many, many years for disability to become a problem for social sciences and humanities to tackle, right? It started from North California, actually, from the Berkeley campus, where many of you are probably located, where um, Ed Roberts, who is my activist crush, by the way, Ed Roberts, who was living in an iron lung, which is this basically like living in a box because he couldn't move any parts of his body. He graduated high school on the phone, by phone. He attended high school by phone. That's how inaccessible in the 50s the country was. And when he attended Berkeley, Berkeley was so inaccessible that he and his friends who had a disability and couldn't get around had to get the Berkeley administration to um, 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 make the campus accessible for them. They didn't hide. They didn't go home. They went to that school and said, you need to change this because I'm not going anywhere. And it's because of them that, you know, we now, you know, it became the independent living movement, and it became a whole thing. And it takes years and years for this to happen. And now we are sitting here talking about it, right? So I completely understand what you're saying, and it is really, really sad that we see it in the case of solidarity too. Like if you think about transnational solidarity with different movements, National Women's Association in the US issues a statement in solidarity with different movements in the world, but not with every movement. They truly pick and choose what movement they want to issue a solidarity with, and they stick to that. I contacted them many times in 2018, 19 to get them to issue solidarity, declare solidarity with Girls of Revolution Street, you know, دختران انقلاب and Leila Mubahedi, and those girls who were receiving really high sentences, and they just ignored me. At the same time, they were doing it for Hong Kong, or what was that group? Jali Qazarda, like yellow vests wearers in France. I would call it social indifference or numbness, but not disability, because disability is very much related to the body and the infliction of pain. I think, yeah, but again, it's just my opinion.
Thank you, Sona Jan. Shahla Jan, please go ahead.
Sorry. Do I hear?
Shahla Jan, so good to see you.
Salam. Salam. So sorry, I wasn't in my best shape. So sorry.
You are always in your best shape.
Thank you so much. So first of all, salam everyone. And thank you so much, Sona Jan. I'm truly humbled, but put that aside, is really refreshing seeing a young scholar bringing scholarship to the community, and in these really fascinating ways. You not only bring the discourse on decolonization of scholarship,
on race theory, on feminist theory, and disability, looking at it in a totally different way. I love the idea of wound, because wound, we often think of it as something temporal, something that can get healed. But when you think about wound in the way that you talk about, also in the sense of hunting, but also the way it registers in mind, and also the way it registers in body, and the body that constantly changes and transitions. So it's never just, I mean, this bringing them together is really very fascinating and very interesting. As I was listening to you, I was also thinking about Açık Söz. I think I told you about this, Saleh Açık Söz work, which is on Turkey and is also about the abled and disabled, and the way the state and religion become, again, I hate these categories to think about them in this fixed ways, but you understand what I'm trying to say. The way they come to actually get entangled in this discourse. Of course, violence is also, in his case, very significant aspect of it. One of the things that he discusses is the cultural aspect of the way we think about ability and disability. Is that right? And I think that's something you bring up in a very interesting way, because you talk about how even the discourse on beauty, is that right? What beauty is itself a social phenomenon that regulates, is that right? Who is beautiful and where it comes from, who decides. And it gives power in those ways of institutionalizing and normalizing what is beautiful, what is ability, what is not. So I thought it's really interesting that on the one hand, as he's talking about the state contract, unwritten contract with able men to go to conscription and end up becoming disabled, and then taking this very ambiguous kind of status where on the one hand they now are on state petition, and so for that reason people think of them as feminized, and he doesn't use these things very easily, and they become reliant on the women of the family and on the state in that sense, again, as the form of protection, and yet they take these other forms. And I was thinking about you going to the nurseries and how there was not simply just the idea of having sympathy, but also kind of selling the discourse of self-sacrifice on the one hand, is that right? And on the other hand, almost distinguishing between the violence inflicted by the state, creating those others in prison and outside by even cutting hands, and on the other hand, these now disabled bodies that have to become sacralized. So I thought these are really aspects of your work that I really truly think add something to disability studies, feminist studies, gender studies, that maybe even though you talk about, but maybe we need to highlight to think through that. And whether in that sense, there was a point where you felt like these various political, cultural, religious kind of discourses came to also take material forms in the way that you are talking about, for instance, about this man who can, tie his shoes and that and this. And how is it that we can actually somehow create a condition that those that do step out of those normalized and kind of imposed political categorizations? And by political here, I don't mean politics in the conventional mode, but in everything that is social and personal in that sense, of course, has the political as well. So I was just wondering what you think about these contentious spaces.
Shahla-Jan, thank you so much. I again recorded what you said. It's just fascinating to again, receiving feedback is just an incredible moment for any scholar, right? It's like people telling you, here's what you're doing, just say it, right? It's just fantastic to have that engagement. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think a lot of parallels that you drew between my work and Atiksu's work, especially as he engages with the Turkey's Kurdish problem and all these soldiers who go and come back disabled, and how the state looks at them. I think again that notion of fetishization comes to my mind, which I'm really in love with, in the very Marxian terms, right? Like, for example, you see this phone. Oh, sorry, it doesn't show. But you see this phone, but you don't see the worker who is oppressed making this, right? So it's like this acts as a commodity fetish that obscures that working relations. And I think this happens with disability too. Yeah. And I love how you highlighted the intersection between gender and sexuality, because sometimes you just, as someone who writes about this, you just forget about all those connections. But I think it is important to think about how in each and every context, those connections are present. Like you were saying, it's fascinating to me that when I was reading when I learned after Women Life Freedom movement that these security forces were shooting women in their genitalia, sometimes aiming for the genitalia or the eye, but especially genitalia. It reminded me of how in Ghazel Hissar, between those like 1982 to 1984 in prison, how Haj Dawood would get women to like do army crawl and then kick them in the genitalia with his boots. It was across time and space, right? I wasn't there. But, this whole notion of post-memory that Mary Hirsch talks about, of how I wasn't there, but as the second generation, because of your generosity and Shekufe's, I have been able to create memories of my own, in places that I haven't even been. And those images travel with me into the here and now, where I wasn't in Iran during Women Life Freedom and I wasn't shot in the genitalia. And yet you bring those two moments of gender and disability and womanhood together across time and space. And I truly owe that to your work and the help that you have given me over multiple weeks, that you helped me think through these things. And Shekufe too. And I really want to thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Sona Jan. I don't know if I don't see any more hands for questions or comments. And once again, I really, first of all, I want to thank everyone who attended this meeting. Again, this is not exactly the easiest topic to listen to, and but a very important one. And I'm so glad that we have someone like you, Sona Jan, who actually focuses and spend your studies on this topic. And wishing
Thank you so
all,
much.
all the best. And I personally do follow your work, and and I look forward to more work from you. And
thank you so much. Please buy the book, read the book, get in touch with me. I would love for you to read it and give me feedback. And again, thank you for spending an hour and a half of your beautiful Saturday. It is even nice here. So I'm in Wisconsin. But thank you for engaging with this work in such generous ways. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, Sonia. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.